Thank you for downloading this Council on Foreign Relations video. CFR is an independent national membership organization and nonpartisan research center. For more information, please visit us online at cfr.org.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for braving the Arctic temperatures and coming out this evening. My name's Warren Bass. I'm the deputy editor of the Outlook section at the Washington Post. I'm delighted to be here with a colleague and a valued friend from whom I have learned much over the years, Stewart Patrick, who will have much to teach us over the next hour or so. I've been asked to remind you to please completely turn off and potentially throw into a pot of water any of your cell phones, Blackberries, wireless devices, unless you have an iPhone, in which case you've been instructed to give it immediately to Stewart. I'm also supposed to remind you that this meeting, unusually for the Council, is on the record, so anything that you say can and will be used against you by, I guess, Richard Haas. I'm going to open the meeting by asking a few questions of Stewart. We'll talk about some of the contents of his book for about a half hour, and we'll then turn it over to your questions. So please think about various things that might be fruitful avenues for discussion as we're chatting up here. And I should also start by thanking Stewart not only for giving us the opportunity to come here and discuss some of these issues, but also for having written what's really an interesting and top-flight book. The Council sort of always strives to produce scholarship that sort of hits at the intersection between academic sophistication and accessibility for a general audience. That is always the aspiration. They don't always necessarily hit it as expertly as Stewart has managed to do it here. And he's managed to produce what I think is not only an interesting and challenging book, but one that's highly readable. And as many of you who have tilled these fields know, writing about international institutions is pretty much where good prose goes to die. And Stewart has managed to steer clear of those minefields, and we're particularly grateful for that. The topic of the book comes at a particularly timely moment as a new administration is taking over, as the Bush administration is leaving, and their talk of revitalized international institutions is in the air, which sort of begs the question that Stewart's book raises, which is, how did we get these things? Where did they come from? And what was the logic behind the United States actually going ahead and creating them? And perhaps I can just start you off by hearkening back to a place where your book begins, which is with an earlier experience that the United States government had with multinational institutions and the idea of a global government, which was with the League of Nations. This was an episode that Franklin Roosevelt was very familiar with. He has an interesting and complicated relationship with the way he thinks about Woodrow Wilson. What did the protagonists of your book think of the League of Nations, and how did that inform their thinking about the institutions that they tried to build in its place?
And that's a great question. First of all, I just want to thank everybody for coming out here on such a cold night, and it's great to see so many friends, and particularly those of you who purchased the books already. Can I say that it's a great question. The League. It's ironic that Wilson, who was having suffered such a terrible defeat with the League of Nations, should have had a boomlet of great enthusiasm sort of by the mid-1930s and certainly the later 1930s, with a sense that somehow the United States had missed its chance. But I think there was an appreciative but also sort of more sober and to some degree skeptical attitude amongst many members of the Roosevelt administration. On the one hand, there was a sense that now with the advent of the Second World War and the expectation the United States was going to emerge as the most powerful country, that there was, as many have called it, a second chance for Robert Devine, the historian, has called it a second chance for the United States to create a framework of international peace and security that would be successful. But I think they had also sobered up from sort of the more intoxicating aspects of Wilsonianism in the intervening years. And so there was an appreciation that any post-war framework of peace had to be grounded in the realities of power, that it had to, unlike Wilson, be also grounded in a bipartisan view that was hard-headed enough to peel away a number of the more conservative elements of American politics, and really ground U.S. leadership within institutions that were also based on American might and had decent safeguards for U.S. national security and freedom of action and domestic sovereignty. And I think the thing that's amazing about, just in terms of how we got these institutions, is that this was in a sense, a reaction to the overreaching of Wilson and then the retrenchment that occurred during the interwar years. And suddenly when the United States emerges from, or is even early on in the Second World War, there's an expectation the United States is going to emerge as the world's most powerful country. And there's a real sense of a country coming of age, and that it was important to absolutely to seize this moment. And but it's not. There's nothing inevitable about why the United States chose an institutionalized vision of world order. I think many times when people think about this, they think that it was just somehow natural on the part of the United States. But if you do some counterfactual thought experiments, and you think, well, what would have happened if the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or even Imperial Great Britain had emerged as the world's most powerful country, the post-war world would have been far less institutionalized, and it would have been a far less rule-bound order. And what you have really is two factors that I point to in the book that inform what the United States did. One of them is American political culture, and particularly the Lockean liberalism that pervades the American polity. And the idea here is that American exceptionalism, which is often used to hold the United States apart from international institutions, was in this case marshaled to try to remake the world in the American image as a peaceful polity under the international rule of law. So that U.S. identity considerations played a part here. But the second major thing that I call attention to is the fact that there were new ideas that had developed from the cataclysms of the interwar period. You know, the fragmentation of the global economy, the rise of fascism, and the recognition that the orthodoxies of isolationism and unilateralism couldn't keep the United States safe anymore. So it's this combination of new ideas on the one hand and enduring identity that helps inform U.S. interests and their calculation.
Is there a precedent for this sort of thing, that great powers historically who have won not just large wars, but this happened to be the largest war in the history of warfare, is there any real precedent for great powers who are sort of deciding that a massive military victory such as the sort that the Roosevelt and Truman administrations experienced, using that as a way to create a new legal framework, as a way of sort of tying down Gulliver rather than letting Gulliver run amok around the place?
Yeah, I mean, there really isn't so much. I mean, there are, John Eikenberry and other historians, and John has a great book called After Victory, which talks about the potential for restraint and the exercise of self-restraint on the part of great powers to try to lock in their advantages over time. But the degree of American, in a sense, magnanimity during this period, and the degree of American farsightedness and enlightened behavior in trying to really embed U.S. power within institutions that actually gave voice and opportunities for consultation of countries that were far weaker than it was is a major change. And to the degree of institutionalization, I would say, is the most profound thing that separates this period.
I'm struck by the word that you used there, magnanimity. Do FDR and company think that they're being magnanimous in setting up this more rule-based and institutionalized world order, or do they think that they're actually being self-interested? Do they think there's not a tension between the two?
I think that in most cases, there's a lot of quotations that I have in there from people like Sumner Wells and even Cordell Hull, who's often portrayed as a sort of a woolly-minded internationalist, that have it both ways. They have their cake and eat it too, in a sense. They see that this institutionalized order is in keeping with the best of American ideals. That in a sense it harkens back to the move from the Articles of Confederation to the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot of sort of historical analogies to America's own past, and in a sense trying to, as once a historian has said, to try to Lockeanize a hitherto Hobbesian world. Wells talks about trying to replace the anarchy of unbridled and discordant nationalisms with some sort of a universal framework, and in trade relations a non-discriminatory and reciprocal framework of trade relations that, as I said, would have been very different from the world of imperial preference and mercantilism. But there's no question that. There's a little bit of hypocrisy here to it at times. The great thing about multilateralism is that it allows you to portray yourself as the benevolent hegemon while sort of hiding your more narrow pecuniary interests. The winding up of the European colonial empires, which is one of the themes in the book in the terms of U.S. support for national self-determination. Of course, it's quite consistent with the idea that the political legitimacy comes from the consent of the governed, but it also allows the U.S. companies and others to make inroads, and perhaps U.S. to have bases around the world. So there are. I wouldn't want to suggest that it's magnanimous, divorced from calculations of sort of what's good for the United States. But I think if you have a Venn diagram of global interests and national interests, there's a much greater overlap in people's minds in this era.
This is what John Eikenberry, who you mentioned, refers to as strategic restraint, that there's something about that the United States affirmatively gets something out of choosing a system that isn't just based on power politics. What is the benefit for the U.S. in this as the founders of the system see it? How do they think that strategic restraint is actually going to pay a concrete and real-world dividend?
Right. I should say that in addition to John's argument, which I believe in, I think there's also a sense that the United States would not be the United States if it did not behave this way. And you see this in, for instance, U.S. opposition during the war to spheres of influence, in direct contradiction to what Churchill and Stalin were trying to work out in their famous percentages agreement when they were going to divide up different parts of the world. So I think part of it has to do with American political culture and American identity, and also what Roosevelt could sell domestically, which he couldn't if it was seen as some cynical betrayal of American ideals. But in terms of what on the sort of more instrumental reason for this. The book definitely takes note of a number of statements from American political leaders and also sort of in their private musings as well about the need to build consensus to make American power enduring, and the need for legitimacy for the United States not to have to be faced into a situation of actually imposing its will. And here obviously the juxtaposition with Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe is fundamental.
I'm also struck by your description of part of the hope of institutionalizing the world in this way is to, as you put it, remake the world in America's image. That's a striking phrase in the context of these sort of great liberals, FDR and company. Remaking the world in America's image is something that we, in more recent history, associate with neoconservatism, with people like Ambassador Bolton, who was not entirely a fan of the United Nations. Is there an idealist streak that you found back in FDR and his advisors that in some way is teased out even by some of the neoconservatives who in other ways have profound differences with FDR?
The way I would describe the neoconservatives is that they're Wilsonians who don't believe in international institutions. They believe in the global expansion of freedom, and whether I'm tempted to say whether or not people want it or not, but they believe in the global expansion of freedom, but they have a lack of self-restraint, or at least the notion that the United States should have a self-restraint. And I think that the limitations of that approach and the costs of that approach in terms of forcing the United States to act in a sense, to go its own way, and also the limitation, particularly when it comes to remaking the domestic, political structures of foreign societies is there. You see it though in the second half of the book, I should say, is the last third of the book, sort of talks about when the best laid plans of the post-war planners collide, in a sense, with the onset of the Cold War. Where when the hope for one world, or what I call the open world, fragments into two, and you're faced with what do we do about this? And what's extraordinary to me, the title is Best Laid Plans, sort of in a sense suggests nothing ended up working, but that's not true. It really the argument of the book is that the United States, to a surprising degree, persisted in some of its liberal internationalist plans, in just transferring the notion of, in a sense, of one world to the notion of free world. And under containment, you still get a tremendous amount of the same approach to international life. But particularly on the chapter on U.S. search for sort of a liberal outcome within the post-colonial world, which focuses in particular on French Indochina, there you get a lot of the sort of hubris of the ease at which this American model is going to be transferred somewhere else. That definitely comes out in a way that I think will resonate to readers when they think about more contemporary experiences of the last several years.
Speaking of some of those contemporary experiences, there has anyone who's sort of been following foreign policy over the past few years, and I think very much including the Clinton administration as well as the administration that's just ended, will notice an ambivalence about America's relationship to the UN in particular, but to other multinational institutions too. Did you find roots of some of those ambivalences about these institutions being unwieldy, corrupt, inefficient, talking shops for tin pot regimes that you're not interested in, delusions of grandeur? Did you find some of these critiques of these institutions going back into your period? And are there people around FDR who are occasionally whispering, maybe this isn't such a great idea?
Yeah, no, there was some of this, I forget who it is exactly, at the delegation in San Francisco, I have a quotation where one of these people just sort of throws up his hands in disgust and says, I don't understand what these small countries keep coming to us and, belly aching about this or that. We could just, sit down in the top of the, Fairmont Hotel with, the Russians and the British and just be done with these people. They're sort of annoying. And you have FDR saying to the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, he says that he thought that there should definitely be a talk shop where all of sort of an Areopagus of the world where everybody gets to come and discuss, but that when it came to pivotal decisions, this had to be left, with the four policemen. In terms of the ambivalence and resulting selectivity with respect to U.S. and multilateral cooperation, there are basically, I've described it as three major reasons for this ambivalence. The first has to do with American power, and this has been exacerbated since the advent of the unipolar moment. Not only do we have more unilateral options, or have had more unilateral and bilateral options than most other countries, but arguably because we are sometimes self-styled, but the ultimate guarantors of world order, this justifies us, in a sense, opting out of certain things that are binding on others. So, classic cases are the ICC, for instance, or the Landmines Treaty, et cetera, because we're exposed. The second thing is really the constitutional separation of powers. Most other, there's a great quote in the book actually of Keynes when he's basically talking to one of another British negotiator who says you have to remember that whenever you talk to an American executive branch official, what they say binds the United States not a bit when it comes to a treaty, because it's a bit like negotiating with the European Union, an individual European Union country now. Because ultimately it has to go through the Congress. So he said, what the Attlee government does, that's going to bind Britain, or at least you can take it to the bank to some degree. And then the final point, so then that's a major factor in terms of treaties. So even if you get more than 50% of senators, if you don't get 2/3 of them, you got a problem. And then the final point is really American exceptionalism, which cuts both ways, and it often is used to, and you see this in human rights treaties in particular, and this notion that American constitutional traditions are going to be, which is not unreasonable, are going to be diluted by sort of alien or things that are in a sense contrary to U.S. political values and are going to violate again the founding principles of our country. And you see the great examples of that are, for instance, on opposition to things like an international treaty for small arms and light weapons, which would maybe violate part of the Constitution in terms of the right to bear arms, etc.
Let me press you for a moment about your point about these annoying small countries, as you put it. The UN's institutional mechanism for dealing with that and making sure that there's a club for big powers called the Security Council, and that's often where the most important action is. There's much talk of expanding the Security Council these days, and that will certainly, I think, be something that the Obama administration will at least be thinking about. Did you find in your research and going back and mining through the origins of the UN, did you find anything that sort of shed light on your thinking or changed the way you thought about the idea of letting some additional members into the Security Council, perhaps on a permanent basis?
It's interesting. Initially, there were going to be 4 policemen, and the only reason that there was a 4th, China, was that I think Roosevelt in particular was quite uncomfortable with the notion that there wouldn't be any Asian presence in the UN, and there were no illusions as the power of the nationalist Chinese government at that stage, much less its sort of internal ability to control its own state. But and then of course France, largely less at Roosevelt's behest than at Churchill's, was added. From the beginning. And there's much frustration. There's frustration with the UN Security Council almost from the beginning, and part of the reason has to do, as it remains, the veto. On the other hand, as Cordell Hull stated to some U.S. congressmen who suggested that this isn't really fair. You guys, a veto means that that seems sort of discriminatory. And he said the United States wouldn't stay in the Security Council without the veto for one day. And this is the liberal Hull saying this. So I think a lot of the frustration with the Security Council today comes from a widespread recognition, and I think this is broad, that it doesn't reflect, it reflects the world in 1945, and it doesn't reflect the world of today, and yet there are incredible stumbling blocks. There's no accident that there's something called the Open-Ended Working Group on UN Security Council Reform. It's sort of, it may even be called the Permanent Open-Ended Working Group on UN Security Council Reform. And allegedly, I guess the UN General Assembly is going to be debating this topic coming up. But the expectation, I think that the sense in many people's mind is, wow, the Security Council is always blocked. That must be because it doesn't reflect the world as it does today. So let's expand it. And there are a couple of plausible plans that came out in the run-up to the high-level summit in 2005. 24 or so members, a few. 4 more new permanent members perhaps, and some rotating elected members from different regions. The difficulty is that there's a trade-off between effectiveness and representation, arguably. Legitimacy has a couple of different components. One of them is, does it represent the world as it is? The other is, can it get anything done? And so this performance component, I think that those two things are very much in tension when one thinks about it, and much less the difficulties of persuading regional powers, regional players like a Pakistan to accept India, or an Argentina to accept, or Mexico to accept Brazil, etc.
Let me ask you just one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. The other institutions that get built over the course of the book are the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, and so on. Those are institutions which are, in some ways, you talk about remaking the world in America's image. Politically, they were also designed to sort of recast the world as capitalist free trading nations in the hope that that would avert some of the economic problems that led to the Depression and brought world order to the brink in the 30s. How do you think those institutions and the people who built them are doing at adapting for an era of globalization?
Great question. Not particularly well is the short answer. I do want to at least say something about the normative content or the purpose of those institutions, because I think it's often forgotten with the sort of advent of the Washington Consensus over the last 20 years or so. And that is to remind us all, I think, that the Bretton Woods institutions were not created with the idea of simple laissez-faire capitalism. And this is, there was, in a sense, a projection of the New Deal regulatory state onto the world. And you see this in a major emphasis placed on, issues of economic justice and social development, to some degree human rights as well, but also sort of the economic components of rights in the United Nations and its affiliated, in the broader agenda. So, I think there was a recognition that the problems of the 1930s suggested that we weren't going to get rid of capitalism, but we weren't going to leave it in invisible hands anymore. And I think that has some resonance in the current circumstance, one might argue. In terms of how they're doing, there's no question that the Bretton Woods institutions need to be their management structures and their governance structures and the voting weight within them need to be overhauled quite distinctly. The difficulty is that to reflect the increasing power of the developed world, the Gulf states and their role, China in particular. The difficulty is that when we face, in terms of institutional reform today, is that we're, unlike in the 1945, there is no tabula rasa. There is, as Dan Dresner of Tufts University says, there is an unclean slate. This makes it very difficult because there are vested interests and it's a zero-sum game when it comes to these things. If you're going to increase China's weight, Belgium is going to lose. Who cares? But the Belgians do. And then perhaps the EU does as well. So there's a lot of oxes that are going to be gored if this happens, and it's going to take a huge lift to try to revive these things. I'll probably leave it there for that question.
Sounds good. I think we've got a great deal to chew on, and I'm now going to turn it over to your questions. You should please wait for the microphone. We've got at least one that will be coming around and speak directly into it. I'm going to ask you to stand, state your name and your affiliation, and please keep the questions brief and resist the urge to filibuster. And why don't we start with Ruth Wedgwood in the front row.
This is my initiation on these beautiful new buildings. I'm feeling very green, my green footprint. I had a question really about how, I'm not a big bang person, that the Big Bang necessarily leads to an inexorable physics that goes on forever. And I'm wondering how you see the continuity of this kind of glad, happy view of multilateralism, which some people see, by the way, as an attempt to keep the U.S. involved. The anti-isolationist mission of CFR, very much in accord with why we were embedding ourselves in the UN Charter, not to restrain American power, but to summon American power. But what I'm interested in is whether, if you take the fact that after June 45, we still have to have Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, so it's still a very traumatic world. And then the very first major venture of the UN General Assembly in Resolution 181 on the partition plan for Israel-Palestine is not enforced. So isn't it an aborted, if you look, rubber on the road and how it would seem experientially to people, it's an aborted birth from the very beginning, one could argue.
That's a great question. The book does not sugarcoat the UN's failings. Nor does it does it suggest that the UN is the only form of multilateral cooperation? I probably didn't make that clear enough in the short sort of description of the book. I think that there was an effort to design the United Nations in a way that there's no question there was an effort to design it in a way that would appeal to Americans the American polity, so that the United States would not return into isolationism. And there's many quotations, I have several in the book, from Roosevelt, basically saying anybody who thinks that isolationism is dead in this country is crazy. And this is, when the notion of membership and political public opinion polls of membership in the United Nations is sky high. I think going forward today, the major question, I think it's important to recognize that the United Nations is hardly the only multilateral entity in town. We live in a world of as Frank Fukuyama has stated, multilateralism. That's both good and bad. It provides maybe some healthy competitions. I know you've written, Ruth, let's give the UN some competition. It can encourage occasionally some unhealthy aspects of forum shopping, and there are elements of some of these ad hoc coalition approach. The mission determines the coalition, as our former Secretary of Defense said, or a la carte multilateralism, as the head of the Council on Foreign Relations calls it. I think that the difficulty is in balancing the advantages of some of the less formal institutions, which can have value, like the Proliferation Security Initiative, for instance, or in the biohealth field, biopreparedness field, there's something called the Global Health Security Action Group, or used to be. I think it's got a different name now. But those are important. But there's no, and the G8 and perhaps now the G20 are extremely important. But there is something to be said for standing, treaty-based international institutions. And granted, they have to be updated. Granted, they're frustrating. There are certain aspects of deadlock within the UN Security Council that have been built in since the beginning as a result of the veto. The hope is that some sense of common purpose can be derived within the UN Security Council framework when the stakes are high enough, and when that agreement can't be reached, then one has to turn for surrogate forms of legitimacy, like the United States did in Kosovo, for instance.
Kristen Silverberg.
Thanks. I had one question and one comment.
Could you identify yourself?
Oh, Kristen Silverberg, unaffiliated, recently.
Tell them your last job.
I was ambassador to the European Union most recently, and former Assistant Secretary of State. I had one question. The UN today is really two different kinds of institutions. It's the body that was originally envisioned, so the sort of deliberative body of member states. But then it's also this large secretariat that employs 100,000 people, that takes about $5 billion a year in U.S. taxpayer money. And a lot of the ambivalence that U.S. policymakers feel about the UN has to do with that part of the institution, not the body as originally envisioned. And anyway, I was wondering if anything in your research talked about discussions at the time of the founding about the dangers of a independent or sort of freewheeling UN Secretariat. And then my comment was just about your point about Security Council expansion. In my experience, the primary objectors to the Security Council as currently constituted aren't the countries who are objecting that the Security Council blocks too often. It's the countries who are objecting, in fact, that the Security Council does too much. So there's occasional grousing, when the U.S. blocks a Gaza resolution or something like that. But mostly it's the countries objecting to Sudan sanctions or Iran sanctions or discussion on Burma who are the primary objectors to the Council as currently constituted.
Thank you very much. Great questions. In terms of, I think first of all, the point you make is very important. There are many United Nations. There's the Security Council. There's the General Assembly. There are the specialized agencies, many of which we find to be tremendously valuable. And one doesn't tar the UN Department of Public Information and UNICEF necessarily, UNHCR with the WHO with necessarily with the same brush. So I think that's very important. There wasn't that much from what I saw when I was doing my research, there wasn't that much concern about the Secretary General, but I think there was also a greater understanding or a sense at that point that he was Secretary, not General. And I think that that has changed over time with the succession of reasonably intermittently with prominent Secretaries General like Dag Hammarskjöld, for instance, Kofi Annan to some degree, but Boutros-Ghali before him. I think now there's I think when Ban Ki-moon, the United States got the person that they wanted, somebody who's workmanlike, et cetera, but has a very low profile. In terms of the management, waste, fraud, and abuse, all of those things within the Secretariat and the bloat that exists there, I think really does undercut the UN's reputation and its prospects on Capitol Hill as well. So it has to be a constant battle. I'm not sure that Ban Ki-moon has taken on that agenda as strongly as he might have. In terms of an interesting point about obstructionism, it's never going to happen without the U.S. being a driving force behind it. But you're right that it's the spoilers in many cases who are obstructing. But the Russians and certainly the Chinese are not enthusiastic at all about Security Council expansion, at least in the direction that we're talking about.
Charlie Brown, Institute for International Law and Human Rights, and also the blog undiplomatic.net. Stewart, you alluded to the U.S.'s long love-hate relationship with the UN and its human rights institutions. When we started with Eleanor Roosevelt helping to create the UDHR, and then went to the Brooker Amendment, and then moved on from there to different times when the U.S. helped create human rights treaties, other times when the U.S. was highly critical. And now we have moving from the Human Rights Commission, which was bad enough, to the farce that is the Human Rights Council. And yet there is a strong belief that without working within the UN system, we're going to have trouble promoting human rights, especially given the track record of the Bush administration.
In terms of this ambivalence, I think one of the reasons is that the entire U.S. Political spectrum could fit into the right of most European countries' political spectrums. So to a degree, we're going to have more. I don't say that that's necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a matter of fact from my view. But I think that so especially if things that smack of sort of collectivism. This is before, of course, we nationalized the banking system in this country. But the things that smack of socialism or collectivism or too much emphasis on economic and social rights as opposed to civil and political rights. I mean, there's no question. I mean, you see where the U.S. is falling on a lot of these things. And again, given the hurdle and the sort of veto opportunities of a third of the members of the Senate, there are major constrictions on major constraints on U.S. Joining some of these things. In terms of the Human Rights Council, whether it was an improvement versus a non-improvement. I mean, it's hard to improve it from the outside. I guess is what I would say. I'm sure Silverberg may have some differences as to whether or not that was a wise decision not to stand for election of the Human Rights Council. My expectation, although I have no inside knowledge of this, is that the Obama administration will reverse that policy. But I think that a few sober-minded people who I've talked to, when they look at the Human Rights Council, they don't think it's going to be an incremental improvement of it.
In the back there.
Fred Tipson with the UN Development Program. Stewart, I'm sure this is a wonderful work of history, and I look forward to reading it. My question is, here we are at the Council on Foreign Relations, the sort of elite of foreign affairs, and so much of the story of multilateralism is the elites deciding how the world ought to be managed. And yet if we look back, recognizing that history doesn't repeat itself, to the 30s, the sort of domestic politics took away from the leaders of the world the agenda in places like Germany and Japan and other places. To what extent is there a story there about international institution building and multilateralism that has to be tempered by the domestic political scene? And to what extent do you think what we're facing now is informed by what happened in the 30s. And as we approach the London conference, the G20 conference, to what extent will politics take away some of the flexibility of the wise men who sit down at the table together?
The analogy is, I mean, again, there was a London conference in 1933, of course, which didn't go so well on a similar topic. And I think particularly in the economic realm, with Buy America provisions and things like that, which, in hard economic times of a major crisis, it's natural for there to be lamentable, but natural for there to be a sort of a protectionist ethos. And so particularly in the economic realm, when countries become very internally focused, and you get this, Sovkeeper, or beggar thy neighbor policies, it takes some significantly enlightened leadership at the multilateral level, but also at the domestic level, to actually try to explain and walk through. And I speak as someone who's generally against these sorts of provisions. It takes some enlightened leadership and a real effort to try in terms that can be broadly understood. And here somebody like Roosevelt ultimately would have been very good at these sorts of things, when using analogies like defending Lend-Lease as loaning a garden hose to the next door neighbor whose house was on fire. This sort of thing is something that Obama is going to have to do if he's. But the problem is that on the economic side in particular, he faces some significant pressure from some of his base constituencies to do this. But at a broader point about the 1930s and the rise of fascism, and there's a quotation I have of Cordell Hull, who says that this cycle of sort of mutually assured economic destruction, in a sense he didn't use those phrases, but he says left the peoples of the world easy prey to desperados, and people like the rise of Hitler, etc. And I think certainly from an event that we both attended yesterday in New York, there was a sense that it is going to get extremely ugly domestically in a lot of countries around the world, as people whose expectations of economic fortunes rising get extremely angry. And so I think we're into a lot of political turbulence. And Cordell Hull did have a great line, which was perhaps not original to him, but "When goods move, soldiers don't," which is one of the titles of a chapter of the book.
Thanks, Stewart. Alex Pascal, State Department. We've talked a lot about the UN today. What I was particularly struck by in the book, however, is sort of how ideas and identity collide with strategic imperative. And I think probably the best example of that is NATO. So I was wondering if you could sort of comment on the formation of NATO and how strategic imperative did collide with American political culture and ideas, but also sort of reflect on is multilateralism a boon to U.S. strategic interest just because of self-restraint, or is it also a force multiplier? And particularly in sort of light of NATO's deployment in Afghanistan today?
Great question. I do have to say that when Alex was an incredible editor of this book when he worked for me as a consultant when I was finishing it up, and when I saw him actually by the table, I thought maybe he was going to be signing them since he had part ownership of the product. Thanks for the opportunity to speak about NATO. The point that chapter makes is that the United States intriguingly promoted a multilateral framework for NATO. And at first glance, it doesn't really, it's not really apparent why necessarily that would have been the institutional form that it would have taken. There were a number of different options that were on the table, including a unilateral guarantee on the order of the Monroe Doctrine, for instance, or a number of different bilateral treaties, et cetera, but often over the objections of some of the European countries involved, including certainly France at the time, at least early on, insisted on a multilateral framework in the same way that it did it with the Marshall Plan, too, as well, which is fascinating. And why would it have necessarily have done that? Probably the only time in history that a dominant power has promoted unity as opposed to division in an area of which it had major interest. So, I don't want to oversell the degree of multilateralism. I see David Kaleo is here, and I quote you as saying that the U.S. chose a multilateral course because to hide the reality of hegemony and the trappings of pluralism. And there's an element of that. Round up the countries in one corral, make it a little easier for them. But it's and yet it's an enlightened manner of leadership, frankly. In terms of Afghanistan, the problem is that it was a lot easier to do this when the threat perception was the Fulda Gap. A little tougher when, you have to, in the Bundestag, have to defend what the hell the Germans are doing up in northern Afghanistan, and try to deal with the national caveats and things like that on troops that are in Afghanistan. So, whether it's a force multiplier any longer is hard to say.
I'm Jerry Livingston from the German Historical Institute, and I work on post-war Germany. I'd like to take you back to the period 1945 to 48. How much of an effort was there really in Washington to bring the Russians, bring the Soviet Union into this multilateralism of which you write? General Clay in Germany made a really rather strong effort up until 1947 and was kind of pulled back by Washington as far as I can make out. Is that true? What were the forces in Washington for and against?
I would say that up until up until maybe early 1946, I think that there was an honest effort on the part of the United States to bring the Russians into this world, and you see this in the and even actually, frankly, in Marshall's speech, in the aftermath of Marshall's speech in June 1947, there was invitations went out, including to the Russians and several members of the of what was becoming the Soviet bloc. But that probably was with the recognition that they were going to say no, because they would find it somewhat deeply intrusive. But you certainly at Bretton Woods, there was effort to include the Russians, and there's expectation that the Russians could be made, if they were made a stakeholder in the system, that there would be some elements of tempering of the antipathy between the two sides. And there's a chapter on the onset of the Cold War and its implications for multilateralism. And ultimately it was this sort of competing universalism and the insistence on in a sense, a closed world as opposed to an open world, at least within its special sphere that made it impossible. In terms of the exact negotiations over and what was going on in Washington at the time over with Lucius Clay and the fortunes of Germany, probably would defer to somebody who's more of a specialist on that topic.
I'm John Sewell for the Wilson Center. Stewart, you've persuaded me to buy the book, so you can rest assured.
Mission accomplished.
I was struck by your discussion of the economic side of the post-war multilateralism. By the way, as a footnote, the Russians also were invited into the Marshall Plan, and the Poles and the Czechs and others, and turned it down. If you believe John Ruggie's embedded liberalism, the counterpart to liberal internationalism was a domestic social welfare state, particularly in the U.S., which didn't have one until the New Deal, and not much less in Europe, which had it for a long time. And that whole panoply of institutions, the Fair Employment Act, the GI Bill, all sorts of other domestic social policies enabled people in the international field to argue that people who in one way or another affected adversely were going to be taken care of. That's all evaporated completely. Even, by the way, if you're a CEO of a major bank, you're going to have to take a huge salary cut. And it seems to me, I'd be very curious in your reactions as you look forward to the sort of wellsprings of domestic social support for all of the multilateralism of the late 1940s, and how it plays out in the period ahead of us now.
Very interesting comments. One thing I should note is, and note somewhat in the book, is that by even the mid 1940s, the Roosevelt and then Truman were increasingly on the defensive in terms of New Deal instruments that had been created domestically. And so in contrast, direct contrast to many European countries which were moving ahead with plans for an even more ambitious expansion of the welfare state, you started to get this sort of bifurcation where the Brits are extremely interested in making the post-war international economic system contingent on full employment policies, et cetera, and extreme intervention into the domestic economy, and you're not really getting that in the United States. So you do start to see a bifurcation there. But I think you can make the argument that there has been a pullback of some of the social guarantees over the years. Going forward, what's interesting at the international level, which I'm more comfortable talking about than necessarily the direction of domestic politics in this regard, is that there's, compared to even the differences in 1945, there's huge amounts of heterogeneity, especially compared to the last 20 years, in terms of international economics. So, at the November 15th G20 summit, you get not just the United States and a number of developing countries or emerging economies disagreeing with each other about these things, but just huge divergence between Sarkozy and what the French and other continental states want to do in some cases, and what the United States is. And I don't think that's going to change that much with the switch in administrations, because the level of regulation that some other countries are willing to accept compared to our own is quite different.
Thanks. David Kaleo from SAIS. I wonder if you had a chance in this book to contrast at all the multilateralism of these institutions with the European ones, with the EU, the EEC, and so on. I mean, you've obviously covered a vast amount as it is, but it's an interesting follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, I do have the chapter. I guess I assume it's chapter 8, I guess, which talks about a world economy postponed. Looks at the launching of the Marshall Plan, but then also U.S. support for some of the early institutions of European integration. And I don't know whether or not U.S. officials perhaps they're fooling themselves more than I thought that they were, but they really are trying to convince themselves that this is a stepping stone, that European integration and the breaking down of the formation of the European Payments Union, of the OEEC, and then ultimately the European Economic and Steel Community, and then obviously a forerunner of the European Economic Community. That is a stepping stone to global multilateralism. And of course, as we've seen, there are a lot of trade diverting and potentially discriminatory aspects of that. But there was a sense that these are again, a way station to global multilateralism. What I do point out, though, is that Europeans were hardly averse to using U.S. pressure to do these things for their own purposes, and so that the European coal and steel community that arises is in some ways very much a response to U.S. pressure, particularly on the revival of Germany, but it meets meets French in particular strategic needs, and says a bunch in there about Jean Monnet and what he was thinking about in terms of playing this intermediary role between the French and the Americans.
Stephen Cull, Program on International Policy Attitudes. When we look back to what was happening in the mid-40s to the later 40s, the idea of the Baruch Plan, Truman talking about putting large numbers of U.S. troops under UN command, many members of Congress, world federalists. Sometimes it sounds like we're hearing about a Star Trek episode or something compared to today. What was different then? Why would these ideas not be taken seriously now when they were taken so seriously then?
There's a couple of reasons. One of them is I think, to get back to Ruth's excellent question or comment, which is, having seen some of these institutions in practice, we have some disillusionment. Seeing the shortcomings of some of these things. I think also that that there's an element in which the Cold War gave the United States a taste for hegemony in some ways that it didn't necessarily have and didn't expect to have, a taste for primacy in perpetuity in 1945, 1946. There's a strong argument in the book that in laying this foundation, and it comes through in a number of statements from major policymakers, that the objective here is to have the emergence of competing and hopefully, but peacefully competing and cooperating independent centers of power around the world. I don't want to overplay that, but there's an element in which restoring, and particularly Europe, to sort of its rightful and historic place is something that shouldn't be troubling, in a sense, to Americans. And I think part of that is also that this, perhaps at the time maybe there were elements of it that were overly romantic, but the idea that you could create an institution in which create a group of international institutions in which nobody, including the United States, was in a sense free of its constraints, and that hasn't totally disappeared. But I should say that those things were lively debated and they were defeated. At the time. So it's not as if there weren't people on sovereignty grounds and freedom of action grounds deeply opposed to the sorts of suggestions that you mentioned. And this is a sort of a continuation of the Lodge and very sober-minded and sensible in some ways views during 1919 that if the United States is going to do this, there have to be major guarantees for its freedom of action and its domestic sovereignty.
I think we can squeeze in one last question. A timid room. In that case, we'll take one quick one from Fred.
Just to follow up to the previous question, I mean, a world that had been traumatized the way the world had been by World War II was willing to consider just about anything at the time.
That's a good point.
But if we look at what we're facing now, between climate change and the coordination of economic policies and so forth, there's no question that we need to enter a new world if we're going to resolve these issues. Now, whether that is the United Nations or whether it's some other form of multilateralism, we're going to have to give up some level of independence to get others to go along. Our real problem is not our independence, it's getting other people to do what we need them to do to solve these problems. And that's going to require some sort of multilateral commitments. So maybe not what we've seen, maybe not what we've created in part by the way we've treated some of the multilateral institutions, but some form of multilateralism is going to have to be built up or we're screwed.
Right.
That's my view.
That's right. In that regard, I mean, I think that there's some, objectively, there's no question that that there's a need for more effective arrangements, not of global government, but of global governance in the sense of sovereign countries coming together and agreeing, in a sense, sometimes to pool sovereignty, sometimes to have some reciprocal obligations to one another, etc. And the reality is that some of this is already happening under the radar screen, and I think that, for instance, the Container Security Initiative, for instance, which is something that has people, U.S. customs officials in Singapore and Rotterdam, and their foreign equivalents in Long Beach, actually checking out cargo and ensuring that smooth flow, etc. That is a non-trivial sort of pooling of sovereignty, and I think that we're probably going to have to see. Michael Chertoff had a very good piece in Foreign Affairs, which says, let's not throw out multilateralism and international law. Let's also not pretend that it's infinitely malleable. But what we need to get towards in dealing with some of the challenges that you're talking about, and he's focusing particularly on the Homeland Security one, terror, transnational terrorism, WMD, is we need to come up with new arrangements that may require, in Richard Haas's words, a little less sovereignty. So.
I think we've had a real sense of some of the expertise and judgment that you'll find in the pages of this book. Stewart, I think, will be delighted to sign a copy over to you. The Christmas is just around the corner. You can start saving them up. But please join me in thanking Stewart Patrick.
Thank you for watching this Council on Foreign Relations video. For additional audio, video, and transcripts of CFR meetings, as well as expert analysis of international news, please visit us online at cfr.org.